Next, let's talk about dominant seventh chords. In our last course, we talked about the idea of the perfect cadence, a 1 chord going to a 5 chord, and then back to a 1 chord. In other words, statement, tension, resolution. Sounded something like this. Statement, we're in C major, here's our Do. Tension, we don't want to linger here forever. We eventually come back or go somewhere else. In this case, we're coming back to our 1 chord. We also discussed at the end of that course the idea of an alternate route where we move down 1 semitone to the 7th note of the scale, which is a diminished chord, and it would sound something like this. 1, diminished 7, back to 1. But what if I took both of those tense chords, the 5 chord and the diminished 7 chord, and we fused them together? So here is our 7 chord, which is diminished. Technically, there's something else called the diminished 7th chord, which we'll probably get to later. It's a 4-note version of a diminished chord. When I say diminished 7 in this case, what I'm referring to is a diminished chord built off of the 7th note of the scale. So we could say 7 diminished maybe. So here's our 7 diminished chord. Here's our 5 chord. We're going to fuse them. And we end up getting our first 4-note chord. In this case, it's called a dominant 7th chord. This one is G dominant 7th. Do you remember before we were doing predominance, the idea of something coming before the 5 chord? Pre being before, dominant being 5. Well, here it is. It's a 7th chord built off of the 5th scale degree and is called a dominant 7th. It's a great way to heighten the tension when you're trying to do your statement, tension, and resolution. So now 1-5-1 might sound like 1, 5, dominant 7, back to the 1. So you can see it adds a little bit more tension, a little bit more color, and it gives you more options when you're trying to spread those notes out and reorder them. So that's what a dominant 7th chord is. It's one way we can create it, but there's an even easier way to think about your dominant 7th chords. Think of it this way. It's a major chord. With what we would call a 7th, this extra note is a 7th because it's kind of like we're taking the 1st note of a scale, the 3rd note, the 5th note, and now our next odd number, the 7th note. But this type of 7th is 1 tone below the octave. Here's G, the bottom note, here's G, 1 octave higher, and here's F, 1 tone below. So that's an easy way, an easy formula for creating a dominant 7th chord. Major chord with a tone below the octave. We call this distance a minor 7th. It's an interval that we haven't discussed yet, but again, just think of it as 1 tone below the octave. And because this chord likes to go back to a 1, it likes to fall by a 5th, that is the primary function of a dominant chord. So a great way to practice these is start with C dominant 7, fall a 5th, F dominant 7, fall a 5th, B flat. So you'll have to practice your 5ths. Again, if you're working with a teacher, you can work that out. A 5th is just 7 semitones. You can think of it that way. So we're going through B, E, A, D, G, and then finish on C major. If you finish on C dominant, it becomes kind of like a dog chasing its tail where the tension never resolves. So when you finish, you can finish on C major or C minor. These dominant chords, when they fall by a 5th, when they fall 7 semitones, they can fall to a major chord or a minor chord. As you might remember before, when we were discussing C minor, we talked about the idea of the 5 chord when we're using C harmonic minor. The 5 chord is major. And again, we discussed this in the last course, but in a harmonic minor scale, the chord built off of the 5th note is major. And in this case, you could also make it dominant. I apologize, some of the note naming on this MIDI keyboard is sometimes going to show a sharp name instead of a flat name, and vice versa. I'm doing my best to manage that as we go, but this will be an example where you should be seeing flats, but you're probably going to see sharps. But here it is anyway. So C minor, G dominant, back to C minor. Or we could do A minor to the 5th, which is E, E dominant, back to A. A minor, E dominant, A minor. minor. So it's used from classical music to pop music. Dominant chords are dominant in the field. They're used all over the place. So get used to them, practice them chromatically, practice them falling by fifths, and every few chords you're going to have to bump it back up a couple of octaves. But just get used to them because they're super fundamental when you are creating your chord progressions, analyzing harmony, or just generally doing anything with harmony. So that's what a dominant seventh chord is. There's a couple of different ways you can practice it as mentioned, and again the formula is a major chord with an additional note that is one tone below the octave. We'll be coming back to these dominant seventh chords recurringly throughout the course, so again this is a reference class for you. If you get stuck on them, come back, check it out, and then continue from where you left off. I'll see you in the next class.